Going to get started. Hello, my name is Therese Corey. As the director of the Jacques Maritain Center here at Notre Dame, it is my very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for our inaugural Maritain Lecture. The Maritain Lecture gathers together students, faculty, and members of the broader South Bend community to address a topic of perennial relevance. This evening, that topic is education. Founded in 1958, the Maritain Center has the distinction of being the university's oldest academic center, founded to carry on the legacy of French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain, a preeminent intellectual of the 20th century and enduring friend of the University of Notre Dame. Among Maritain's various contributions to the academy and public discourse was his proposal for an integral Christian humanism, affirming the human person's fundamental need for material sustenance, social fellowship, and what is most important, for spiritual communion with God. The center's first director, Joseph Evans, drew deeply from Maritain's well and harbored a special passion for awakening in his undergraduate students a sense of wonder for their own humanity. Through his example in the classroom, Evans inspired many students to discern a teaching vocation and share this vision with future generations. The Maritain Center continues to take this holistic vision of the human person to heart in its contributions to contemporary discussions about human flourishing in society, mindful of the perils that attend a curtailed vision of the human person. It is with an eye to this theme of integral humanism and education that I am honored to introduce Professor Margarita Mooney Clayton, who will speak this evening on Jacques Maritain and creativity in education. Professor Mooney Clayton is an associate professor in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, where she teaches courses that span philosophy, theology, sociology of religion, and the liberal arts tradition. Beyond the classroom, Professor Mooney Clayton has been an advocate on behalf of the arts, liberal arts education, and religious inculcation through the liturgy as sources of cultural renewal. To this end, Professor Mooney Clayton founded the Scala Foundation in 2016, for which she continues to serve as the executive director. The Scala Foundation seeks to form a new generation of artists and educators by hosting workshops, seminars, and summer programs taught by leading scholars and practitioners in education and the fine arts. Professor Mooney Clayton's publications testify to her interdisciplinary scholarship and attentiveness to audiences both within and beyond academia. In 2009, she authored Faith Makes Us Live, Surviving and Thriving in the Haitian Diaspora, drawing upon sociological fieldwork to show the significance of faith for self-understanding amidst trial and displacement. In the same year, she co-authored Taming the River, Negotiating the Academic, Financial, and Social Currents in Selective Colleges and Universities. In recent years, she has written on topics aligned with her mission of educational and cultural renewal, publishing The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts, and The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Art and Education, with Clooney Media Press in 2021 and 2022, respectively. Her writing has also been published by such outlets as America Magazine, First Things, Real Clear Policy, Scientific American, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Without further ado, I invite you to join me in welcoming Professor Margarita Mooney Clayton.
Thank you. It's a really great pleasure to be here tonight to share with you how Jacques Maritain has been an intellectual companion of mine since I entered graduate school in sociology at Princeton University in 1998. Although I'm going to focus tonight on this topic of creativity in education, I thought I would simply foreground the talk by letting you know this is not how I initially encountered Maritain, but I hope what I'm going to say tonight actually extends from my initial encounter with Maritain. I encountered Jacques Maritain in the late 1990s, entering graduate school in sociology, where my primary concerns were about the development, economic, political, and cultural development in Latin America after the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. My mother is from Cuba, and after I graduated from Yale, I was really interested in pursuing work on peace and economic development. Worked for 3 years at the Arias Foundation for Peace and Human Progress based in Costa Rica, and went from being an idealistic undergraduate at Yale to seeing the reality of really total destruction and the attempts to rebuild society from the ground up. At the same time, I had the opportunity to travel to Cuba, where I still had relatives, and saw the effects of 40 years of totalitarianism and atheism. And when I entered sociology, I was struggling between these questions of how do you foster an economic development that's integral, that includes the whole person, that doesn't exclude the spiritual dimension in the name of lifting up the material. And it was those kinds of questions that a mentor named Paul Sigman, a professor of political science at Princeton University, told me to look up Jacques Maritain. So I did, and I devoured his writings in French and some in Spanish. And then interestingly, when I mentioned this new interest of mine to my mother, she pulled out from her father's papers a whole series of writings of Maritain that had been translated into Spanish. And it turns out that my grandfather, who was a professor of engineering at the Catholic University in Havana, had groups in the 1950s reading Jacques Maritain and discussing ways to do economic development in Cuba that would further human freedom, promote economic development, and respect the spiritual dimension of the person. Now, by the time I received these papers, those dreams, of course, had not come true, but I could see that Maritain was somebody who I could look to as an exemplar in my own vocation as an academic, because he walked, I thought, this really tough walk of being deeply engaged with metaphysical questions, but really caring about the practical implications and being willing to engage with the questions and the realities. And he had shaped people in my own family and in the Christian Democratic Party throughout Latin America. So I turned to him as an intellectual interlocutor, but also as an exemplar of the kind of life that I wanted to live. Now, what I'm going to talk about tonight, I think, stems in some way from that initial interest on, or my initial concern about these sort of poles of totalitarianism and the meaning of freedom, but I'm going to apply that more tonight to the realm of education. I will come back to this slide later on in the talk, but this opening slide here that I have, I think, tries to get at this second, or a turn in my career, which, when I began to wonder about what some have called a form of soft totalitarianism, and what you can sort of see in the background of this poster is a student protest. And although I deeply empathize with the causes of social justice that motivate a lot of students, I was concerned at the lack of actual deep and complex thinking about these problems. And so there seemed to be, on the one hand, a lot of ways in which politics was leading students to quickly pick up a slogan or a poster, but I wasn't sure what those students would do if they had to spend 10 years working in a community trying to actually build something constructively. And so what I've come to see is that students were also telling me that there was an increasing concern about the psychological fragility or depression and this kind of cancel culture. And so I felt that a lot of students seemed to be torn between wanting to have a cause to fight for, but not having a real strong sense of their own character or personal identity. And just having done the work that I had done in Latin America, I thought, well, this isn't going to add up. If you want to pursue a cause of social justice, you have to have an interior life that's rich, that's robust, and that can help you continuously renew your vision and renew your energy. So I began to think, and what I'm going to focus on tonight is how I actually think looking at some of Maritain's work on creativity and on art imitating nature can actually get us to some principles in education that can help students both to reinforce their desire for what they do to be relevant in the world, while also grounding them in a tradition that allows them to recover a graced imagination and to develop their own inner dynamism which Maritain always emphasized is the real motivator, is the real engine of change, is that inner dynamism of the person in communion with God, whose inner self is shaped through practical action and reflection to create solidarity, the common good. So, when I was asked to give this talk, I thought, oh, great, now I get to delve into a part of Maritain that I haven't looked at in a while. So I will say that what I'm going to say with you tonight, what I'm going to share with you tonight, is it goes beyond what I have published to this date and led me to go back more to his debate, I think, with the Romantics and with the Pragmatists. So what I think I like about Maritain as an exemplar for the intellectual life is that he was masterful at looking at a practical problem in the world and then calling our attention to the deeper philosophical human questions that lay behind that. And he always called attention to an understanding of the person as a unity of body and soul. Whereas I think what I see in his book, Education at the Crossroads, is that he's debating in that book with people like John Dewey, for whom there might still be a language of the spirit or the inner energies of the person, but they fundamentally have redefined it. So this slide I have here, I think, is trying to illustrate this dualism that many people have between the material and the spiritual side of the human person. For many people, what makes something real is that it's scientific, something that can be measured, something that can be manipulated, something that can be tinkered with. And in Education at a Crossroads, it's precisely this mechanistic view of the person that Maritain is critiquing John Dewey for. And he says that, and I think a lot of people aren't familiar with what Maritain is referring to in Education at a Crossroads when he says that Dewey has a stony, positivistic view of the human person. And what I like to point out is that what oftentimes, so John Dewey, for those of you who don't know him, he was a philosopher living in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was also very concerned about making philosophy part of public discourse and creating a common identity, furthering democracy, getting education out of the elite and into the masses. But what people don't often know is that Dewey was actually trying to introduce a new understanding of truth and of the human person that got rid of what he said was this encumbrance of an idea that there is a pre-existent eternal being, essentially the Christian notion of God. And what he says is that actually we need to free the sort of inner religious energies which are held kind of in encumbrances of creeds and cults. So he wants to preserve, Dewey wants to preserve the spiritual impulse, but free it, break from tradition, break from an understanding of a transcendent God, and then when we release these values, they will become even more important in society. So John Dewey is the person I often go to because he was a philosopher who expressed these ideas philosophically as a new understanding of the person that Maritain is saying in Education at a Crossroads is essentially materialistic and then leaves the realm of religious creeds and cults. They might be important, but they're at the level of feelings and they're at the level of impulses. They've now been separated from reason and separated from tradition, and in fact are thought of as encumbrances to the search for truth. So, what does Maritain say about the definition of the person? Well, I mean, the image I use to express what I think Maritain wants to get across about the human person is that the human person is a unity. Now, when I explain this to students, I like to put up some of these ancient, this prototype of the mother and child called the Ogetria, which probably in this room many people have seen, but I show people that for Maritain, the unity of body and soul was so important that in Christianity we've had to paint this image of mother and child again and again to show the idea that the material is not separate from the spiritual, that in fact God, who is eternal, has taken on human flesh and elevated the material through grace, right? This is the primary claim of the human person in Christianity, that the material is a creation of God and is elevated to participate in the divine life through the supernatural. And this image of Mary and child is emphasizing the sanctity of the human person and representing the material while also pointing to its elevation above nature through grace. And the picture on the left, which some of you may be familiar with, is an image of St. Luke painting this image of mother and child. So throughout the history of Christianity, it's not simply the preservation of the text or the ideas, but the preservation of the images and the kind of art that express the nature of the human person were thought of as fundamental to communicating this understanding of the person. And for Maritain, I think it was interesting for me to learn, as I learned more and more about him, that he had an engagement with the fine arts from the time even before he converted to Catholicism. And one of the first things he did after his conversion was ponder the nature of art and the meaning of art for questions of the human person and the common good. And he came back to this question later in his career. So the first thing he published on art was called Art and Scholasticism, and then much later in his career he published Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, because he understood very clearly as a philosopher that the kind of material culture that we create expresses an idea of the human person and human dignity. And again, coming from the experiences I had had in Latin America, and in particular in Cuba, with a lot of destruction of images, of sacred images and of churches, I knew that the ideas that we have about freedom, about the human good, take on a material form that then reinforce that meaning. And so now back to the image of the Duomo, which I had up in, which was the key image that I chose for this talk. This building, the Duomo in Florence, was designed by Bernarcelli. And I learned about the history of this building. I had visited it actually a couple of times, but I learned about its history when I was in Italy on a trip on innovation and creativity with the Princeton University Engineering Department. And I learned at the time that Bernarcelli designed this, nobody thought that this building could be built. They thought that the angles wouldn't hold, they thought that the dome wouldn't hold, and he had this vision. And I picked this to illustrate what I'm going to explain to you now, which I think is Maritain's understanding of art as a virtue, which comes from Aquinas, to illustrate what I think is so powerful about the Duomo, that the mathematical principles of harmony and integrity and proportionality are an imitation of the natural order, which allow for human creativity, not simply to reproduce what has already been done, but to perceive the deep embedded structures and then bring that into a new form and create something which previously did not exist. So part of the reason that I have turned many times back to talking about Maritain and his work on art and creativity is that in order to address the questions about education that I care about, which I mentioned earlier, which are on the one hand, the psychological fragility many students have, yet their sense that they're called to some sort of larger purpose than themselves, something they want to participate in. When I started to bring back in ideas of liberal arts education or tradition, students just seem to think that as soon as you begin to talk about tradition, you're breaking their authenticity, or there's no such thing as creativity, and that tradition is somehow a box that prevents you from being creative. And what I've learned by reading Maritain and looking at his debates with the Romantics is that essentially students have internalized this idea of creativity as nothing more than simply expressing our inner passions, right? So the challenge with the Romantics is that many of them were not philosophers. It was more of an artistic movement. But when I've presented students some quotes from someone like Friedrich Schlegel, when he says that Not art and artworks make the artist, but feeling and inspiration and impulse. So what characterizes a romantic view of creativity is this idea that actually we need to break from tradition and break from rationality and free the internal passions and energies to express the awe-inspiring powers of nature or the sublime. But what's been lost from that is that when you break from tradition and rationality and free open the spirit, there's no sense anymore of the need for God's grace. There's no recognition of the possibility that our passions and our emotions can be hindered or disordered. So the romantics, like Wordsworth, poetry is passion. All good poetry originates in the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, have really broken with the idea that yes, the human person has creative passions and imagination, but that, like our bodies are subject to decay, our spiritual faculties are also subject to distraction, and they're subject to disorder, and they need to be redeemed through grace. And so what I found so compelling about Maritain and art and scholasticism is that he's absolutely concerned with questions of the artist and the vision of the artist and the creativity of the artist. But he's also very clear to point out that the artist is an associate of God in making beautiful works. He says in art and scholasticism, the artistic creation does not copy God's creation, it continues it. And so what I think it's really important today to remember that Maritain was pointing out, he's going back to Thomas Aquinas and saying that art properly understood is imitating nature. But as Maritain says in art and scholasticism, art isn't imitating nature by simply copying something or reproducing it. But the correct understanding of imitation here is by proceeding or operating like nature. So again, what he means by that is that human beings have a capacity to look out through the senses and to see what's visible, but then to perceive the inner working of the form and to then bring that form back into the world that is creating something that didn't exist previously and copying, but in the sense of copying the mathematical principles based on harmony and integrity and proportionality, so that the things which we create are an authentic creativity because they're a participation in the divinely created order. So Maritain says that this is the joy of imitation in art, and it's what gives art its value of universality. So for Maritain, like for Aquinas, a proper understanding of art and creativity has to restore the connection between creativity and intuition and the practical intellect. Art is concerned with the good of the work created, not the good of the subjective feelings of the artist. So good art conforms to the rules discovered by the intellect to bring things into existence. So in his book, Maritain uses the example of a raft that in building boats that would float on rivers, we learn rules, we confirm those new rules, and over time, we build better and better rafts. Well, what was Bernascelli doing in designing the Duomo? He was taking forms that existed, looking at their proportions, looking at the harmony, and then with his vision, the vision of the artist, imagining something that didn't yet exist, but that he thought would conform to those principles, and then see if it works. Now, if you talk to inventors, people who've made scientific discoveries, the reality is a lot of their intuitions don't work. They have to try them out. But this idea that scientific creativity fundamentally comes from simply setting up an experiment and tinkering one thing after another overlooks the inner dynamism of the artist, the vision of the artist, that actually, in order to have scientific creativity, has to conceive of something that you can't see, but then try to bring into being using what reason and the intellect tells you. So again, in this vision of Aquinas passed on to us through Maritain and through other contemporary authors, such as Brad Elliott, the imagination in the intuition is an aid to the intellect, but it can't on its own express beauty, because to express something beautiful, it has to be connected to the truth of the human person. So what I often show students to sort of contrast what has happened, what's at stake when this understanding of beauty is rejected, and you get to a romantic understanding of beauty as purely self-expression, expression of the passions, or a really kind of pragmatist vision of beauty where what we create in the world is measured by nothing other than its utility. So just to give an example of what this romantic view of art has done in the fine arts, I show students to contrast. The picture on the right here is a Picasso. It's the Demoiselle d'Avignon. And in here you see what Picasso says he was trying to do. He's breaking with tradition in terms of lines and proportionality. And his depiction of these figures, he thought we could get to a better understanding of the human person by going back to nature outside of civilization. So these images are actually taken from African masks, where somehow the thought of that there's sort of a primitive person who hasn't been corrupted by civilization. But what kind of an image of the human person and the human body or femininity does he give us? And I contrast that piece of art with a statue that's from 2021, I believe, by artists Aidan Hart and Martin Earl, which conforms to the earlier prototype that I showed you of the Ogetria. It's a statue of mother and child, where, again, you can see that it's conforming to a tradition, yet bringing that tradition into the present, and showing the dignity of the human person and the unity of the person. Whereas here on the Picasso painting, we don't get a sense of the unity of being. We get a sense of the fragmentation. So here also, what I sometimes ask students, I put these two buildings up. One on the one on my right here, so maybe your left, is the Boston City Hall, which again, it's an example of modern architecture breaking with harmony and proportion. And I put also on the left a church building by architect James McCreary, also of recent years, which you can tell builds on the ideas of harmony and proportion. When I was walking around campus earlier today, I was really struck because I went into the building with the golden dome on it, whatever that building is called. And when I stood at the top of the steps and I looked down, there was an incredible integration of architecture, nature, and design, because your eye is drawn to this one long sidewalk that has trees coming up on the side of it. You can see Jesus standing in the middle. You're standing at the entrance of this giant dome. And so all of the senses are drawn on and this is what Aquinas means by there was a wholeness of vision when you're standing in that spot, where your eye can move from point to point, but yet what you're seeing, forms a part of a whole. And it's designed for you to have that experience. The Boston City Hall is not designed for that. It's designed to break up your vision. And look, walking around Princeton University's campus, there are a lot of wedding parties and first communions and whatever else. And I can tell you, they don't stand in front of buildings that look like the Boston City Hall to take their pictures. No photographer being paid to frame you in a moment in time is going to take you to the Boston City Hall, or frankly, to the new Princeton Art Museum, which looks like a giant air conditioner dropped onto campus. And what I learned by looking at this was, just to take an example of like the arches on the McCreary building here, why do so many photographers go to those kinds of arches at Princeton University to take a picture? Because it frames the human face. Because you have both a sense of the human person in a landscape, in a place, but the face becomes visible, whereas in front of a building like the Boston City Hall, you can't really distinguish the human form. And so part of the reason I care about this so much is what I hear from parents and what I hear from students is that there's such a barrage of images and sights and sounds coming at students. And I used to think not very much about those images. But I think I was actually taking for granted that I had been raised in a place and a time where my primary exposure to images and sights and sounds came from my Catholic school, my Catholic parish, playing outside, which I understand a lot of children sometimes don't even do anymore, which I find actually kind of hard to believe. But the imagination, the storeroom of images and sights and sounds simply isn't being nurtured anymore. And when that happens, what I think Maritain was prophetically foreseeing was that when that happens, the intellect can no longer function, because we are not simply a body with a computer attached on the head. The human intellect cannot be reduced to a series of computations. There are intuitions, and there are intimations, and there are inspirations, but that really, in the Catholic tradition, is the storehouse, it's the store of images that needs to be worked out through the practical intellect to build and to co-create and to direct those intuitions and intimations to participate in God's divine order. And if we fail to understand that, we'll get art and architecture that not only looks strange, but is communicating a vision of the human person that is, I think, ultimately dehumanizing. And again, my experiences in Cuba certainly have shaped my thinking about this. When they destroyed, the church in my mom's hometown in Cuba, small little town, had been turned into a movie theater, right? So they took this church, turned it into a place of entertainment, and what amazed me 40 years later when we went back to visit was that someone took us around to the backyard, and one man in Cuba had decided to hide the stained glass windows that had belonged to the church and kept them in his backyard, covered under piles of wood and canvas, hoping that one day the church would become a church again. But what happened in Cuba was not only that they closed the churches and that the windows weren't there, they also stopped cultivating the rose garden, because cultivating a rose garden isn't part of anything utilitarian. It's simply for the beauty of it. So this town where my mom had grown up no longer had a sugar mill in it, no longer had a rose garden, no longer had a place of worship. And when you take the spiritual and the transcendent out of the material completely, what I saw in Cuba was people stopped caring about the material, because they don't have a vision of how the material is part of God's creation and needs to be worked with, refined, and brought to participate in a larger order. So, what I want to take from Maritain on creative intuition and art and scholasticism is this idea from the Romantics that tradition is an impediment to creativity actually has it backwards. That it's the mastery of form is what yields the production of content, not the rejection of form. And what Maritain was concerned about was a lack of imagination, not only of extreme talent, but a general dulling of the creative and spiritual forces of intellect and will. And this, I think, is the crux of his debate with John Dewey in Education at the Crossroads, and I think it's what led him, towards the end of his life, to return to this topic that he had talked about in Art and Scholasticism and write Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, where he looked at modern movements in the fine arts and tried to recover, yes, the subjectivity of the artist, but the subjectivity of the artist who knows that his personality is fundamentally shaped through an encounter with God, and that the use of the intellect is fundamental to directing the artistic activity towards something authentically beautiful. And so the freedom of the artist is not breaking from tradition or rejecting timeless principles, but rather a participation in the divine order. Now, maybe it's more, so just to give a few examples of this, what does this look like today? The crucifix on my left, maybe on your right, is a very recent design by an artist in Princeton named Juana Belcha, who published an article recently in Dappled Things, where she talks precisely about how she as an artist approaches tradition in the way Maritain describes, trying not to simply copy what was made before, but to discern the principles, the harmony, the movement, the designs, and then create something new. She created this crucifix for an event I'm co-hosting next week in Princeton with the Scala Foundation. That's going to be a celebration of Solemn Vespers in the Sarum Rite. And we wanted to commission new art so that people can see that art today still can be made according to these principles, yet show the tradition, yet bring in new elements, different styles of color, and a different bringing together of things. But what she wrote in Dappled Things was that as an artist, the way that she approaches tradition is what she calls mindful copying. And she says mindful copying is like deciphering a code. It's a way of understanding not only the technical aspects of an artist's work, but how artistic decisions impact meaning and how successful the artist ultimately is in communicating it. So for an artist like Juana, who sees her art as, in the way that I've described it, contributing to the common good, co-creating with God, she's looking at the freedom and the artistic creativity not as a rejection of the tradition, but as a kind of perception of the deeper forms of the art that shed a vision onto the technical aspects that allow her to then co-create something that participates in God's beauty. Similarly, the crucifix on my right, so your left, is a crucifix that won the Sacred Art Prize at the Catholic Art Institute for 2023 this past year. It's by an artist named Martin Earl, working out of Chichester. And I put this up because it is also, if you can probably tell, it's inspired by the San Damiano crucifix in Assisi, but also intentionally drawing inspiration from a different crucifix commissioned by the same person who's the Bishop of Aberdeen, Scotland. And when I visited Martin Earl's studio, what I thought was so impressive about the work that he's doing to revive this tradition of sacred art in Chichester is it's an intentional master apprenticeship model where he learned the craft of his art from a master iconographer named Aidan Hart, and he's now taking commissions and bringing in new apprentices to work with him in a way that the learning is not simply on the technical level, but authentically on the personal level, where the vocation of the artist to serve God and to co-create with God is done in community. So this kind of old, for lack of a better word, guild model of art is the way that many of the fine arts, in particular visual art, used to be made. And it's been largely lost, and in fact, even the language of talking about masters in art has been lost, because the idea in the Romantics is that every work of art is its own judge. And as I mentioned before, there doesn't need to be a tradition that tradition is stifling. But the question that I tried to put before students and for you is, well, what kind of art would you like to contemplate for the rest of your life? Or for all of eternity? And what I want to say, and I want to get back to science and creativity in a moment, but I actually think that this is a really important moment for Catholics to take up this question of art imitating nature and the true nature of creativity as co-creating with God. Because what I think Maritain, again, drawing on Aquinas, is doing is elevating the role of the human person, yes, to create things in this world, but to acknowledge that we can only do that as co-creators with God because we have to develop the facilities of receptivity, the ability to be still and to contemplate things in order to then direct our passions and direct our creativity towards the human good. So, in my book on beauty and liberal arts education, I talked with several scientists, people in the areas of physics, microbiology, and the idea that somehow innovations or progress in science can be made apart from this notion of human creativity as imitating nature is really not what the history of science tells us. So when I talk about what does this look like in education, I think what's missing is a lot of time especially in the younger years, but also even as we get older, for spending time in nature and actually observing nature. There's an educational philosopher, Charlotte Mason from England, who talks a lot about experiences in nature, starting with sense perceptions, touching things in nature, and allowing young people to have unstructured time in nature, but then bringing them back in the classroom and helping them discern the principles behind what they've seen and touched and felt, right? So getting back to the embodied and the personal. Conrad Pepler, an English Dominican, also writing about this, and a younger Dominican, Sister Thomas More Stepnowski, calls this method of like looking out and looking in. So giving students a chance to be out in nature, actually looking, contemplating, touching, but then creating the spaces of stillness and silence and contemplation for them to be able to have that space to make those connections and to develop their intuitions and spark that creativity. So again, in the Catholic understanding of silence or contemplation, silence isn't pure absence. It's not fleeing the material world, but rather feeding the imagination, feeding the soul, so that we can find a stillness that is a fullness. And then out of that fullness, come back to our vocations as co-creators. So Father Brad Elliott, talking also about Aquinas' understanding of art as a practical virtue, argues that art and morality are two aspects of human participation in the reason and creativity of God. And that art and morality are both ways that humans imitate their divine creator. Because in being co-creators with God, it's not only that we're imitating nature in terms of creating new material things, such as these beautiful things, but that when we're co-creating with God, we are imitating the divine intelligence which God has bestowed on the human person and which confers us the dignity of bearing the image of God within us. So it is precisely the capacity of the intellect not only to work at the speculative level, but at the practical level that gives human beings their dignity. So this is actually why I think that so many students who are searching for authenticity and for identity are also, at the same time, often really pulled into kind of group behavior or group think, kind of, that they're looking for some way that their own personality, their own vocation participates in something bigger than themselves. And we need to honor that, but I think that as educators, we have a responsibility to present to our students things worthy of being imitated. And this is what I think tradition really should be. These are things worthy of being imitated. These are ideas, forms of art that are worthy of being imitated, not simply copied or reproduced, but of being looked upon with this contemplative spirit to draw out the principles and discern the way in which those principles can be brought into new forms. And so, what does this actually look like to practice as an educator? Well, I would say there are many both opportunities and challenges, but I have made some adaptations in my teaching where, in order to help students understand these principles, for example, when it comes to writing or even to reading, I encourage students, like in a recent class I taught, to just take a passage from Augustine, let's say, and to write it out by hand. Sometimes even for younger students, maybe college students would do this too, to act it out on video, right? To put themselves in the voice and the person of these exemplars from tradition, and to enter into, because I think in the actual doing, not just this kind of thinking, but the doing, the connecting the thinking and the doing, can spark creativity. So the end is not simply to memorize something from Augustine, as great as that is, but that in the act of memorization, you're internalizing what's being said so that it shapes you. And again, as Christians, the practice of the liturgy of the hours, the chanting of the Psalms, I've started to do that myself in the last couple of years. Well, and it turns out that every 30 days, you can get through this cycle of Psalms, which is full of images, and is essentially all of salvation history being repeated throughout the structure of the Psalms. And it grounds our lives in this larger transcendent order. And so with my students, I try to share that practice. I think we can bring back the chanting of the Psalms. I think everybody, this was in the Psalms today, sing praise unto the Lord. It's amazing to me how many people don't know or don't think that they know how to sing. And I wonder if the idea that singing is an act of gratitude towards God, that capacity to rejoice at simply being alive, has been lost. Having, again, spent time in Haiti, I'm not saying that there aren't real serious problems in Haiti having to do with material poverty and all kinds of political and economic struggles, but there is a capacity to rejoice and to be grateful, which I often don't see in my classrooms. And I think that's because there's an ability to perceive behind the material world God's animating presence. So within education, just to sort of conclude my remarks, Jacques Maritain in Education at the Crossroads lays out a curriculum that includes what I think a lot of, especially K-12 classical art schools are doing, a return to the 7 liberal arts, an emphasis on the imagination, especially at the younger years. But what I think Maritain is also arguing for, and he says this really strongly in Education at the Crossroads, that the true engine of education is not the content that we put in front of students, but our own vision of the human person and learning to stimulate the internal dynamism of the student to be able to encounter what's happening with that tradition. So it's not enough simply to have the right the right curriculum, as important as that is, the actual interaction between the student and teacher itself is meant to be a participation in God's communion of love with us. And what I see from students is that they're looking at teachers, or they're looking for role models, for people to emulate. Not just ideas, not just books, but people whose lives have been shaped by those ideas, who live by the principles that they're teaching. And that's what drew me to Jacques Maritain some 20-something years ago, was whether or not I agree with everything he's ever written, I don't know because I haven't read it all. But I do know that he was somebody who truly cared about the questions that he was living, and who wanted to go to the deep fundamental questions and wanted to be engaged with those seeking practical solutions, was willing to work with people who were different than him, who persevered through very difficult times, because he ultimately was a man of faith who believed in God's redemptive work in the world, even if we didn't always see it. And that kind of hope, I think, can only come from a life of faith. And I think students are looking for authentic moral exemplars that can guide them and give them a reason to hope, and from there present them a tradition, whatever that may be, in the science or the fine arts or whatever the subject matter is, but present them with models worthy of being imitated, with knowledge, and ultimately with a way of life that allows them to be co-creators with God, and in doing so, discover their inner dynamism and allow God's grace into their life to direct their inner energies towards creating something worthy of human dignity and that builds up the common good. Thank you.